When we look at the events of the last week in India, when we look at the events of the last number of months, whether it's the economic crisis, as well as just the crisis situation that the world is in, not only the Jewish people, at this time, it behooves us to ask ourselves, obviously, what are we to learn from this? How are we to reflect on this, and what is our response? I'd like to preface the remarks this evening by saying that I am not offering tonight any deep secrets. I'm obviously not in a position to say I have the answer. And obviously when dealing with issues like this, we are arousing not only the intellectual aspect of ourselves, but the emotional aspect of ourselves as well. I remember a number of years ago when September 11th happened, and my brother, who lives in Detroit, was asked to give a set of shiurim on Tzaddik V'Ralo, Rasha V'Tovlo, to understand how does good and evil happen in this world. And he called me up and he said, Shira, do you have any information on this that you can, share with me to prepare shiurim? And I said to him, don't touch it. Don't do the shiurim. And in the end, he didn't do it. I said, because you're not entering into an intellectual arena here. Anytime you deal with a tragedy, and in this case, what happened in India, not only to this one Chabad family, but to the shluchim as well, to the people who were involved in hashgacha and leaving very large families, you're obviously arousing an emotional response. And that emotional response then has a trigger effect where then people say, I also know of, and how does God allow for? And then suddenly we become so overcome with emotions that it's very hard to be able to really treat the subject in a way that is able to look at it in a much more absolute type of way, and in a much more honest type of way, without getting our emotions and feelings involved. So having said this, I'm saying that the challenge for tonight is a very great one. And therefore I'd like to divide our discussion onto two levels. On one level is to touch in very briefly on an approach, if we can allow ourselves our emotional feelings to just be kept in check. I'd like to look at an intellectual approach, which I think is a very, very powerful approach, the very famous work of the Rav Soloveitchik and Kol Dodi Dofek. I'd like to take a look at this in terms of how do we as individuals deal with evil. Then to step back and look at it not so much from our perspective, but Klape Shemaya, how do we look at it in terms of a Kadosh Baruch Hu? And that will be the first part of the Shir Mirz Hashem today, our reflection. And then I think, which is the real major part of the Shir, is once we have reflected on whatever level we can, then the question is, well, what is our response? What can we do proactively as a result of this reflection? And I'd like to focus in on today primarily one approach in terms of our response. And this approach that I am going to take is based on what I have heard from the Gedolim and the leaders of today, saying that this is one of the major areas to focus in on. And I am just taking their cue and developing it. Let's begin with the reflection part, and then we'll move to the responsive part. The Rav in Kol Dodi Dofek, very famous essay, speaks about that there are two ways that we could look at man. We could look at man as an object, or we could look at man as a subject. We could look at life as a life of fate, or we could look at life as a life of destiny. And the Rav first develops, and we'll just mention it briefly, the life of fate and the life of an object before we will focus in on what I think is more relevant to us, the life of destiny, the life of a subject. So the Rav notes in source number 1, where Judaism with its realistic approach to man and its place in the world understood that evil cannot be blurred or camouflaged, and that any attempt to downplay the extent of the contradiction and fragmentation to be found in reality will neither endow man with tranquility nor enable him to grasp the existential mystery. Evil is an undeniable fact. There is evil, there is suffering, there are hellish moments in the world. Whoever wishes to delude himself by diverting his attention from the deep fissure in reality, by romanticizing human existence, is naught but a fool and a fantast. It is impossible to overcome evil through philosophical, speculative thought. Therefore, Judaism determined that man, entrapped in the depths of a frozen, fate-laden existence, will seek in vain for a solution to the problem of evil within the framework of speculative